Welcome to the Taos Institute's Relational Research Network video series. In this series, we explore research from a relational perspective. We hear from people working with a relational research process and learn about related values, concepts, and practices. To start, here are some of our ideas. Research from a relational perspective embodies a philosophical and co-creative stance. It is thus not a method, per se, but rather a collaborative way of being. Engaging from this perspective entails an ethical responsiveness to a focus of inquiry. Recognizing that reality is created through language and social structures means it can also be recreated. Relational research is a process that is attentive to broader relations and interactions. The purpose is to expand possibilities and co-create transformative potentials. We hope you enjoy the series and invite you to join in the conversation. Arlene Katz, a conversation with Papusa Molina and Rocio Chaveste. Finding our way together, relational inquiry as poetic engagement. Arlene Katz is a Taos associate and lecturer in global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. Her work emphasizes the importance of hearing the voice of the community, for instance, in addressing ageism. A published poet and photographer, she integrates social and cultural poetics, making visible the moral dimensions of care and social suffering. Relational research becomes a form of mutual inquiry that develops step by step with the participants, becoming co-teachers, co-learners, co-researchers. In Arlene's collaboration with community elders, they begin by walking with them, inviting them to share what matters to them, and to engage moment by moment in a multi-voiced dialogue with professionals. Through poetic reflection, they noticed what they were struck by, articulated it in dialogues, which then could be carried across in other practices. Such exemplars are touchstones of engagement that invite us to recall the lived experience of an event.
Thank you very much for being with us, Arlene Katz. Thank you very much for having this conversation. This is space for us in conversation. And what we really want to know that you could tell us a little bit about how are you doing this relational work, this relational research in the hospital or in your private practice or teaching or in any activity that you are doing as a long time ago.
Okay, first of all, muchísimas gracias por invitarme.
Gracias a ti.
I think the truth is, whether it's research or teaching, I am, it's a way of being in the world, is to be relational. And that has a lot of things along with it. And I can talk about different projects that I've done. It has to do with honoring the other person and being willing to create meaning together rather than coming in with a set of ideas that you would like to impose on another person. So that's one part of it.
Can you talk a little bit about to honor the other person through this relational way of being and research and in your work?
It has to do with walking with someone rather than coming in imposing what you want to have happen on them. And so I've done this with various groups of people that don't usually have a voice. So older people, unfortunately, in this society, usually are erased, or if you ask a young doctor, sometimes they'll say, well, the last person I saw had this bag of medicines and it was going to take too long. And so if you ask them what matters to them, they might say, why are you asking me? You're the expert. You have to tell me what's important to you.
Amazing what you have done in the hospital with the elders.
I think the secret is to not have it be in any one place. And so with the elders, for example, we were wanting to teach young doctors about what mattered to older people. So instead of seeing them in the hospital, what we did was meet the elders eventually in a center, a family center, a community center. So you're always bringing in the voice of the community and the voice of the elders. And so they don't have to be narrowly defined to only be in the hospital. And I remember, you have to be willing to take the time and even be surprised. So that when we ask the elders one at a time, what do you think doctors should know about working with older adults? They said, why are you asking us? You're the expert. So then you have to say, okay, how can I say this in a way? So I said, if your daughter or granddaughter were to be a doctor or the commissioner of health, what would you tell her?
Just thinking now, what do the elders say about your work? Do you know what do they think about what you were doing and all of this? What were their response? How do they respond to all of this work you have done from this perspective?
One of the ways we worked is that we met with each group of people to reflect on what just happened and what they would want to see over time. So it was what I call this work I described as processual. It's a relational process. So, so that over time we would meet, and then if you meet with the young doctors and say, what would you ask for advice? What would you, if you're going to talk to the elders, what would you talk about? And they would start with, oh, this 80-year-old woman who comes in with this diagnosis. Okay. So then you say, well, what do you think they would understand? Would they understand that? What would you? And so on the day, so they modify and they create, co-create, okay? And so then they come in and they say, on the day, they might, the young resident would say, I have someone in my practice who I care very much about. And I'm afraid because of my youth, I might miss something. Now that's a big shift, right?
Also, and I was also thinking about the professionals with whom you work in the hospital. What happened with them when you do all of these things? What happened?
That's a wonderful question. And well, it happened over and over again, because again, every X amount of time we'd go back, we'd meet, and I would say, as you know from my work, what do you remember? What were you struck by? You know, what did you carry with you? And they would always, they talk still, and I'll get to this in a moment. This is now many years ago. They still talk about having one of the 100-year-olds on their shoulder, and they still carry them with them. Mm-hmm. So as the head of the chief of medicine said, you changed the culture of the residency. And now I'll get to the interesting part. I just wrote a paper. It was on social poetics and shifts. And what I did was I went back to one of the residents who had presented about how old people fall. And he went in, and I wanted to go back to that moment. And I called him up, it was 15 years later. And I said, do you remember when we met? And he remembered everything. And he said it changed his whole way of being in the world. It changed his profession. And so it carried over many years later. I just wrote a paper about it. Carried over many years later. He's still saying, and you should have a council like this in every community.
I know you are trying to ask something.
Yeah, because I was thinking as you were talking is you were talking about what the doctors or the medical students, now doctors, remember of that experience. And I was thinking, I always think when we do research and we publish and we write about the phenomenon of audience. So for whom were you writing? For whom were you, who did you have in mind as you were writing the results? And also, how did you bring back, quote unquote, the results to the elders?
I have them in mind all the time,
Mm-hmm.
which is always a challenge when you're writing for a journal, because you have to be, because they expect a certain kind of language to write about someone rather than along with them. Every step of the way of that project, and the ones that follow, because this wasn't the only one who did this with, always bring it back, always bring it back. So we made videotapes and we showed them and asked them to reflect. Every X amount of time, we go back and we say, what do you remember? What are you struck by?
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than prove a hypothesis, we're always looking for surprises.
What are the difference you can see or highlight of doing this kind of relational research or this research with the others? That you, if you have your group of students in front, what would you say to them?
Carry them with me. And what I might even ask, what would they say right now?
Mm-hmm.
You know, Harry Galician would always say, what would they say?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's always carrying them with us. And what's interesting is, now going back 15 years later to write this paper, everyone remembers it still.
Mm-hmm.
How could that be? Because it's so unusual to, and this, you could say, this is about respect, it's about humility, that you are, you know, Arlene talks about sharing expertise, but it's more than that. It's making way for what matters to other people.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, I've made a lot of film on this stuff, and I've never been bored looking at it again.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's the willingness to be surprised. You think that's part of it? What you said?
Mm-hmm. And do you think because I teach research methodology and I facilitate a thesis seminar, I'm always asking myself, how do you teach this? How would you teach a group of students to do this type of research, to engage in this type of inquiry in their daily practice or in their work? How would you say, what would you say to them?
To notice. People are taught to come in with a list of questions and go through the questions.
Mm-hmm.
And they get very nervous because they want to make sure they ask the right question in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
This young researcher says, this is so different. You want me to learn what they're saying. And I was taught to not only take every question, but to say it in exactly the same tone, in exactly the same words. And there was someone who started to cry in front of me. And I couldn't say, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, we're up against the, you know, being human
Mm-hmm.
versus mastering a certain way of going. Would you agree with that, Patricia? Would you run into this?
It's because it's a question that is always in the back of my mind, you know. Is there a right way to teach this? Or how do I pass these ideas to a new generation, to younger people
Mm-hmm.
that come from especially from undergraduate degrees into our master programs with a very kind of square, fixed idea of what research is, and also who is capable of doing research.
But you know, it means as teachers being willing to take the risk of doing it slightly differently, you know, and so you come up with certain. I remember, you know, listening to someone presenting in a seminar, and then they said, well, there was this finding, but you know, it was an outlier. You know, so I remember I asked, were there any, and I always ask, were there any surprises? And then there's a pause, and I said, well, there's someone who's an outlier, didn't fit in with our main hypothesis. And so you say, but were you surprised by it? Well, actually, it opened up a whole new question that I asked. But you know, what you're asking, both of you, is a very important questions. How do you honor this, have it but be legitimized? So maybe the young researchers have to be bilingual.
I really would like to do a different way of going through relational research, or doing another kind of research, not the traditional one. How can you invite?
Oftentimes we use audio tape and videotape. We tell people's stories in their own words, and then ask them, and then create in the room the way of working, the way of being that you're talking about. So it has to be consistent. So I might just show a piece of video and ask them to write down what do they find striking or unusual. And then we recreate the same methods that we're talking about. And so you go from that to then being in dialogue with each other to articulate what was striking, and then how it can impact their practice. So it's kind of trying to recreate in the room the engagement that you're trying to describe.
How can you relate social poetics in what are you doing in relational research? How do you connect?
I think I was just describing the it before naming the it. So, and that's what I do. I try to have people experience the it and then put words on it. So like in the old parlance, it would be inductive, right? Rather than deductive. So I would, the whole graphic of you, as you know, of social poetics is starting with what you're struck by, what do you notice, what's unusual. And then the next thing is you articulate it in dialogue, which is relational, it's all relational. And then it makes visible the values and what matters. And then you talk about how you carry it, or how you could carry it over into practice. So I think that's very relational. I mean, for me, I don't make that distinction, except by maybe pointing out, maybe if you're in a film making a stock frame, but even that's a relationship. I'm not sure how clear I'm being.
I was thinking, Arlene, if we didn't ask you, no questions from me or from Rocio, what is that you would like to tell us about your work?
I think I've been doing it, but well, I think it is respectful. It's about movement. It's about being processual, but it's about dignity. And in these times that we're living in, it's so important to create the environment for dignity and respect.
Mhm.
And so those are my values, coming across. Yeah. And yeah, I think I've been doing it.
For the video.
Right. Now, the other thing is, I don't know if you've seen the chapter in the handbook, the social construction handbook. It captures what we're talking about. It's called Toward Relational Engagement, Poetic Reflections in Healthcare. Okay. So that they're both there. And what we did was, this is Kathy Clark and I invited a woman who was a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, who then got diagnosed with MS. And so we wrote the chapter with her by using the reflecting process in the chapter.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. And she ended up creating works of art from her MRIs.
Ooh, that's beautiful. I cannot wait to read it.
I started to say how I carried this over to different populations, so it wasn't just elders. And I've been working with a Haitian American, Haitian actually, physician, seeing groups of Haitian people with diabetes. And so it's a peer group where they teach each other and they dance and whatever. And one of the students decided, traditional third-year student, I have an idea, he says. I'd like to interview the patients and the professionals, and I'd like to make a video of that from the different views. Has anyone ever done that? And my Haitian colleagues started to laugh and laugh and laugh. And he did that. And so we talk about how this is carried over. And what we did was I said, look, you can't just take the video. We showed the video to them and said, anything you don't want in there is out. No questions.
Well, that's nice.
Thank you again for being so generous with your time for all our audience. And we hope to see you soon and receive a big hug, but in person.
Un abrazo, abrazo.
Un abrazo.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arlene.
Thank you to Papusa Molina, Rocio Chaveste, and Arlene Katz. More about Arlene at www.taosinstitute.net/Arlene-Katz. Please join in the conversation. What captured your attention in this video? How do you think these ideas reflect a relational orientation to research? Please leave a comment on this YouTube page or join our community at www.taosinstitute.net/relational-research-network. There you can find a lot more information and resources. We thank the Relational Research Network leadership team for the vision and dedication to making this video series come to life.